Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking Minnesota Management and Budget and the dedicated state agency employees who allow us to do the work in the legislature of creating a budget for the people of Minnesota, allow us to have highly accurate forecasts of future spending and revenue collection, and serve the people of Minnesota every single day with tremendous dedication, ability, and conscientiousness. And all Minnesotans should be very thankful that we have state agencies that perform so effectively as Minnesota Management and Budget, and I should also say the Minnesota Department of Revenue. We are tremendously fortunate to have their dedication at our disposal. Obviously today, House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and the governor are largely aligned on the news that this brings. We know that Republicans in the legislature will have a different view. And so none of us could have that argument without the dedication of state employees to make numbers that we can all work with. This is good news in numbers, but it really tells a tale of two Minnesotas. While simultaneously our budget is bringing in more revenue, or our state is bringing in more revenue than planned, and our economic forecast is better than expected, we are also a state that is dealing with record racial disparities, with rising homelessness, unaffordable housing, unaffordable health care, and challenges for Minnesotans who are working full-time or more than full-time to make enough money in order to support themselves and their families. All DFLers support strong investments in health care, education, economic security, and community safety for all Minnesotans. And as we look at the future of this budget, we see that there are great challenges ahead. In fact, because of past budget deal-making under Governor Tim Pawlenty, our surplus story is really more of a fiction, and our fantasy forecast is not going to allow us to continue to invest in core services. The fact of the matter is that if you look on page 41 of the budget book, in the 2022-23 budget, we are projecting $220 million of budget surplus. That does not include the $1.2 billion of increased cost to provide the same level of services as we have today. So the future is a budget deficit for Minnesota unless we take steps to increase revenue or start spending less on things that Minnesotans value. We do not have to have a great education system. We do not have to have great roads. We do not have to take care of people when they are seniors or when they are disabled. But if Minnesota wants to do those things, we need to align our revenue with those goals. Simultaneously, we have an aging population. We have a rising student population with greater needs than teachers in the schools have seen in many, many years. And we have an economic imperative to educate those students as well as we possibly can for the future. The budget pressure of an aging population and a more demanding student population means that Minnesota has a deficit, not just $1 billion in future years, but a deficit of investment in the people of the state, which is what's going to drive our economy in the future. I think this should be positive news in the short term, but very sobering news for the long-term health and economy of the state, and I hope that we can start taking steps to get going again towards a more prosperous future for Minnesota. Lyndon?
I'm Lyndon Carlson, Chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and I do want to make a few comments as well. I think one of the things that we can point to is the strong budget reserve having reached our target. I have a long history in the legislature and working on budgets over the years, and one of the concerns I had historically was the need for a good, sound budget reserve. And so the House and Senate a few years ago worked together to set a target, and we have now finally achieved that target of almost 5%. Technically, it's 4.9%, but we have reached that target. So we're at that budget reserve level. However, I would point out that's a moving target because as our budget expenditures change, then that target changes. So as the budget stands, we are there. That's probably one of the better pieces of news from my perspective in the forecast. I do want to mention a few concerns I have. One is trade policy. We do know that there's a negative impact on parts of Minnesota as a result of the trade policy that's in place at the federal level. And we don't know if that's going to be resolved short term or not. I always view the November forecast as a benchmark. The real forecast that we're going to be building the budget on is the February forecast. And whether there's any changes in trade policy between now and then could dramatically change things either up or down. I do have some concern, though, when I do follow the business pages and the comments that are made, that that's probably not going to be resolved before the February forecast, but perhaps it could be. We do have some concerns about business investment is down, and I'm told that that's in part due to the questions about trade policy. When you look at the forecast, I think we have to keep in mind that we do have an economic slowdown. It's still a positive growth, but it is a slowdown when you look at the out biennium. A couple of things that are important to note. We have more job vacancies than we have workers available. Even though we've had an influx of people into the state of Minnesota, there's still a gap there. And that, I am told by representatives of the business community, that that's slowing, at least on an individual basis, the ability of some businesses to grow and expand. So I think that's an issue that the legislature is going to have to take a good look at and see if there are some things that we can help in regards of closing that gap. So I do want to exercise some words of caution when we look at the out biennium. And when I work with the division chairs, quite frankly, I'm going to ask them to look closely. In fact, I've met with a couple already at their budgets and what they can do in terms of one-time expenditures. We call those tails when we're looking on into the future. But I think we're going to have to be very cautious about future obligations as we move forward. Our first hearing at the Ways and Means Committee, we are going to include on the agenda some discussion about the forecasting of inflation in the budget. And if you look at the report by the Council of Economic Advisors, they have repeatedly pointed to that as a problem. And I plan on having some discussion on that. In fact, I've introduced a bill already that might be the centerpiece of that discussion. But at any rate, I think the Senate is up next and will be available for questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Kent, State Senator from Woodbury and the Assistant Senate DFL Leader, and in today for Senator Bach, who is out of town with the Council of State Governments. Just want to add a few comments. A lot of great information has been shared today. It is, as always, a mix of good news and then challenging things that we need to make sure we're keeping an eye out. We know that this is just the most complex issue we deal with, is how we allocate these important resources. We know that there is, in that good news, there are pockets where it really is not working for Minnesotans, and we need to be ultra sensitive to that. And I look forward to the session and the ideas. I appreciate very much the spirit from Governor Walz in terms of working together and trying to figure out solutions that do work. I especially appreciated his comments and Majority Leader Winkler's in talking about the effect of inflation, because that is real. And actually, we've been talking about this for several years in our caucus, that when you look into the out years, the picture becomes not so rosy. And the question was brought up about the surplus and the perception of the surplus, because it is a lot of money. But when I talk to people in my community about that, I often make the analogy that a surplus, if it's one-time money, is like getting a really good annual bonus at work. You have that and you can use it, but you're not going to go out and get a new mortgage with that. If you get a raise in your salary, that's ongoing money that you can bank on and you can plan for. And that's the difference that we have to deal with. And I think it's important for people to understand that because we don't have inflation built into this, a surplus that looks generous in the short term really will not be available, and it doesn't allow us to make the improvements that we need to in our schools, in in our transportation system, and in caring for Minnesotans who need the care. And one thing we know is that Minnesotans definitely want to make sure that we are caring for each other. Thank you very much.
So my only comment is to reinforce what Lynn said relative to the budget reserve. We've worked very hard on that. As Lynn mentioned, that came about in 2014. I think the original legislation was authored by Rod Skoy and myself in working with the House Democrats. And I just want to make it very clear that, and maybe reinforce what Lynn said, but make it a little bit more stronger. The budget reserve is not a slush fund. It's not a piggy bank. There's no question on the perspective of the DFL that it was a mistake to have utilized the reserve this year for purposes of balancing the 22-23 budget. And I would suggest that the legislature in this upcoming session should keep their hands off the reserve. It's going to be needed at some point in the future. We've had a lengthy economic cycle on the positive end, lengthier than anything post-war. And at some point, the economic cycle catches up to us. And when it does, we'll want a budget reserve so we're not borrowing money from schools or anyplace else. And it would be incumbent on this year's legislature, despite the shining object of the budget reserve and the amount, to keep our little hands off of it.
Questions?
The governor was rather sunny, and by your own assessment, you called this sobering news. Are you on the same page in your reaction to this?
I think we are on the same page. Those were your adjectives, not ours.
You said sobering.
Did he say sunny?
No.
No.
Are you on the same page
Yes,
in your
I believe
approach
we're
to
on the
this?
same
And how
page.
so? But you had a lot of caution, and he saw a lot of positives in this.
I think Tim Walz is a very positive person, and there are a lot of good things in this forecast. There are a lot of good things that have happened in the last budget, and a lot of good things happening in Minnesota's economy. What he talked about was a business climate that works, a diverse economy that is producing generous job growth and has for some time, but it doesn't mean that it is all rosy. And I think we have to be mindful that a lot of Minnesotans are struggling with a lot of long-term challenges in their own personal budgets, their family budgets, and in their ability to have housing, childcare, quality schools, healthcare. All of those things that are essential to live a decent life in Minnesota are more and more difficult for people to afford. And that is historically the role of state government, to help make sure that our prosperity is inclusive of everyone. And we cannot do that if we are just facing future deficits. That's the challenge.
And what about appetite for tax cuts? It was the minority leader in the House who said full repeal of the provider tax. And I don't know if you saw the governor's reaction. He said, no way. Are you in the no way camp too?
I would be surprised if Senate Republicans wanted to repeal that, since they just voted for it and we got it done together. There is no way that Minnesota can afford to repeal the provider tax at this point in time.
Tax cuts? Any appetite for anything else?
I don't think there's a big appetite for a major tax bill this year. We managed to put together a budget that balanced last year. Obviously, the reserve comments are accurate. It was not a perfect budget, but it worked. And if you look at the future, significant tax cuts of any kind make it more difficult for us to provide core services that Minnesotans value.
What about transportation funding, Mr.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that we do need a tax bill, and that there are some unanswered tax policy questions that we need to address. And in particular, many, and this is true for the Republicans as well, and the Senate Tax Committee are very concerned about the lack of affordable housing. And what are the tools that we can use to bring that to Minnesotans, whether it is one-time money through grants through the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, whether it is changing the property tax code that encourages developers and landlords to provide more new affordable housing and supporting affordable housing in place. We can use Minnesota's tax system to do that, and we should. So tax cuts are in the eyes of the beholder, but a good tax system that allows us to have shelter in sprinkled buildings, quite frankly, it should be a goal of all of us, and it is a challenge for the tax committee.
What about transportation funding? What's your feeling on that? Should that be advanced in some way, shape, or form this upcoming session?
Well, we have a significant unmet transportation need in roads, bridges, and transit in Minnesota and throughout the state, not just any one section of it. I think the challenge of addressing transportation funding last year indicates that doing so in a non-budget session with the bonding bill in front of us will be much more difficult than it was last year. I wouldn't give it a lot more hope next session than we ended with last session. Well, I know that Representative Murphy has been exploring a bill in the range of $3.5 billion, and at least two of the budget standards would permit a bill of that size. Obviously, the Senate Republicans and the House Republicans think it should be much smaller, and that is the primary work of this coming session.
Do you also agree with Senator Cohen that the legislature should keep your hands off of the surplus?
I think he said keep our hands off the budget reserve.
Sorry, off the budget reserve.
In the expectation that we will have a recession and that having a reserve will help mitigate the impact of that recession in future years. I think that's correct. And the $490 million that came out for 22-23 was not something that any of us, I think, felt good about, but it was as good as we could get under the circumstances of divided government.
Is there interest in doing one-time spending for some of the things you mentioned, housing, racial disparities, things like that with the surplus?
Well, I do think we will be exploring a supplemental budget that would primarily focus on one-time spending, not something that was going to create tremendous ongoing expectations. The bonding bill can have cash in it. We can move individual transportation projects. There are a lot of ways that we can spend money one time, but it's important to remember that this forecast is assuming that that $1.3 billion does not get spent in future years. And so we really have no cushion if we spend all of that money on a one-time basis. It really is an indicator that we are not in structural balance if you include increased costs of providing the same level of services. We're only balanced if you assume we are slowly going to let the air out of the tires of the services that Minnesotans count on.
And I just wanted to add on the subject of using one-time funds, there are a number of ways in education that we all agree are very important, and that has to do with making sure that our students are safe and well cared for in their school buildings. We've seen the recent reports in terms of the number of requests that came in from last year's round of funding. Of course, it far surpasses the funds that were available, and so there would be an opportunity there. And that can be used for the buildings, it can be used for technology, any number of ways. Another thing we can do, and this is something that I've been pushing for a number of years, is increasing a matching grant program for more counselors and psychologists and social workers and nurses and chemical dependency counselors in our schools, because that's one of the things that the research really shows, is that we can harden the buildings all day long, but if our students are really meeting these challenges and we're not supporting them and their families, they're at great risk. So.
I guess just to clarify, so Republicans are likely going to say this is time to cut taxes, we have a surplus. You were saying spend some of it?
I think we have to be cautious about spending even one-time money because we have little, other than our budget reserve, we have little cushion in future years. The current projected budget balance is based on not spending any of the $1.3 billion. And so if we make one-time expenditures, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we may be making future deficits worse by doing so. Thank you. All right, thanks.